Raymond slammed both hands on the kitchen table so hard the coffee mugs jumped. Emma froze, spoon halfway to her mouth, eyes wide. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at the voicemail still playing on his phone, his mother-in-law's voice calm and surgical. "You're going to ruin that child, Raymond. A little girl needs a mother, not a soldier playing house." He hit stop. 30 seconds of silence. Then Emma set her spoon down very carefully and said in the smallest voice she owned, "Daddy, are you going to send me away?" He crossed that kitchen in 2 steps, dropped to his knees in front of her chair, and grabbed both her hands. "Never. You hear me, never." She searched his face the way only a 6-year-old who has already lost one parent knows how to search a face. Then she nodded, picked her spoon back up, and Raymond stayed on his knees a moment longer than he needed to because his legs weren't steady yet. What he didn't know was that 3 miles away, a woman had just read his daughter's school file, and she was already deciding he was worth fighting for. Comment your city right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe and hit the bell. What happens next will stay with you. The morning it all started, Raymond Cole burned the eggs. Not because he was distracted, not because he was tired, though. God knows he was always tired. He burned them because Emma had come running into the kitchen in her socks, sliding across the linoleum floor arms out, like she was landing a fighter jet, and she crashed straight into the back of his knees, and he'd grabbed the counter to keep from falling and knocked the spatula clean off the stove. She thought it was the funniest thing she'd ever seen in her 6 years of life. He stood there looking at the blackened eggs stuck to the pan, and he started laughing too. Because what else was he going to do? Cry. He'd already used up his crying. He'd done all of it, every last drop, in a hospital parking garage 14 months ago, sitting in his truck with both hands on the steering wheel, the engine off the rain coming down hard on the roof, while inside the building the nurses were doing what nurses do after someone doesn't make it. He wasn't going back to that place in his chest. Not today. Not in front of Emma. "Daddy," she said, looking up at him with her mother's eyes, the exact same shade of dark brown, the exact same way of looking at him like she could read every single thing he was feeling. "The eggs are on fire." "They're not on fire. They smell like fire. That's called crispy baby. That's called burnt daddy." He scraped the pan into the trash, pulled out 2 granola bars, set them on the table like he'd planned it all along, and said, "Congratulations, you just invented breakfast." She climbed into her chair and tore open the wrapper and said very seriously, "I'm going to tell Mrs. Patterson you can't cook." "Mrs. Patterson already knows. She's seen my face." Emma giggled with her mouth full, and Raymond stood at the counter drinking his coffee. Black, no sugar, the Navy had taken every soft habit he'd ever had, and he looked at her. Really looked at her. The way she held her granola bar with both hands. The way her hair was already half out of the braid he'd spent 20 minutes doing at 6 in the morning. The way she swung her feet because they didn't reach the floor yet. Don't let her see it, he told himself. Don't let her see the fear. Because the truth he carried every single morning was that Raymond Cole was terrified. Not of combat, not of deployment, not of any of the things that were supposed to scare a man who'd spent 15 years in the United States Navy. He was terrified of the simple, ordinary, relentless weight of doing this alone. The packed lunches, the school pickups, the permission slips he forgot to sign. The parent-teacher conferences where every other seat in the room had 2 people in it and his had 1. The nightmares. Emma sometimes had the ones where she woke up calling for her mother, and how he'd go to her room and hold her and say, "It's okay, I'm here, I'm right here," and mean it with everything he had, while knowing that the one thing she was really crying for was something he could never give back. He was enough. He told himself that every morning. He wasn't always sure he believed it. 14 months earlier, Raymond had been stationed at Naval Station Norfolk, running logistics for a unit that moved faster than most people breathed. He was good at his job. Better than good, he was the guy his commanding officer called when something needed to be done right quietly and without excuses. He had 15 years of that reputation, and he'd earned every one of them. Then Sandra got sick. It wasn't sudden. That was the cruelest part. It was slow and quiet. and it gave them just enough hope every few months to make the next piece of bad news feel like the ground falling out from under them. He took every leave he could. He drove back and forth between the base and the hospital more times than he could count. He sat with her on the nights she couldn't sleep. He held her hand during appointments and asked questions and wrote things down in a notebook because she couldn't always remember, and someone had to. Emma was 5 when Sandra died. 5 years old, which is old enough to understand the word gone and young enough to believe that gone might still be temporary. Raymond had taken emergency leave. Then he'd gone back. Then he'd taken another leave. Then he'd sat in his truck in that parking garage and made a decision that took him 30 seconds to make and would take the rest of his life to understand. He was going to resign his commission, not because the Navy asked him to, not because they hadn't tried to accommodate him, they had. His commanding officer, a broad-shouldered man named Captain Holloway, who had never once in Raymond's presence shown a single emotion that wasn't mission-related, had sat across from him and said quietly, "Cole, you don't have to make this decision today." And Raymond had said, "I know, sir," and then he'd made it anyway, because Emma had no one else. Sandra's parents were in Phoenix, too old to relocate, barely managing their own lives. His own mother had passed 3 years before Sandra. His father had never been the kind of man you called when things got hard. He'd been the kind of man you learned from by watching what not to do. So he'd walked into Holloway's office, set the letter on the desk, and said it out loud. "My daughter needs me more than this uniform does." Holloway had looked at the letter for a long time. Then he'd looked at Raymond. And Raymond would never forget this, the man had stood up, walked around the desk, and shook his hand. No argument. No speech. Just a handshake and 2 words, "Yes, sir." Raymond hadn't expected that. He'd expected to be talked out of it. And when the argument didn't come, something in his chest cracked open in a way he hadn't been prepared for. Because sometimes it's the respect of a man you respect that costs you the most. He settled in Chesapeake, close enough to the base that the community felt familiar. Military families, veterans, people who understood what it meant to carry something heavy without making a performance of it. He found a house with a small yard because Emma needed a yard. He found a school that Mrs. Patterson, the kindergarten teacher, ran with the kind of calm authority that reminded him of the best officers he'd ever served under. He found work as a logistics contractor. Government work, familiar rhythms, decent pay. Not the same. Nothing was the same. But it was enough. And he built a life. Not the life he'd planned. Not the life he and Sandra had talked about, the retirement, the travel, the slow, easy years they were always going to get to eventually. He built the life that was actually in front of him. One school morning at a time. One burned batch of eggs at a time. He told himself it was enough. He met her at the worst possible moment. Not the worst moment of his life, he'd had that in a hospital. But the worst possible moment for meeting someone you might actually care about. Which is to say, he was carrying Emma on his back because she'd twisted her ankle at the community center's fall festival. He had her princess backpack over one shoulder and a half-eaten funnel cake in his other hand. He hadn't shaved in 4 days, and he'd just walked straight into a folding table and knocked over an entire display of brochures. They scattered across the floor like a deck of cards thrown by someone who'd lost a bet. He stood there, Emma laughing on his back, brochures everywhere, funnel cake somehow still intact in his hand, and a woman was crouching down already picking them up, and she looked up at him and said completely straight-faced, "Rough landing." He blinked. "I'm usually more coordinated than this." "Your daughter seems to think this is normal. She thinks everything I do is normal. She has no point of comparison." The woman stood stacking the brochures neatly. She was his age, maybe a year or 2 younger. She had the kind of calm in her face that didn't come from having an easy life. It came from having figured out what mattered and deciding to focus there. "I'm Victoria Shaw," she said, holding out her hand. "I run the transition support program here. We work with veterans and military families." He shifted the funnel cake to his left hand and shook with his right. "Raymond Cole, former Navy. Currently a mobile jungle gym." Emma waved from his back. "Emma," he said, "say hello like a person." "Hello like a person," Emma said. Victoria laughed. And it wasn't a polite laugh. It was a real one, sudden and genuine. And it changed her entire face, and Raymond Cole, who had spent the last 14 months not noticing anything about anyone, noticed it. He filed it away immediately. Told himself it didn't mean anything. He started seeing her at community events. That was the thing about Chesapeake. It was a big enough city to disappear in. But the veteran community was tight, and the circles overlapped constantly. Victoria ran workshops at the community center every other Saturday. She organized resource fairs. She showed up at school fundraisers because half her client families had kids in the same schools. He started seeing her and told himself it was coincidence. She started talking to him, and he told himself it was professional. Emma called her the nice lady with the curly hair, and then 3 weeks later, Victoria, and then with the unsettling accuracy of a 6-year-old who senses things adults are still pretending aren't happening, simply her. Is her coming to the thing on Saturday? Raymond would say. I don't know, Emma stopped asking. But he knew. And the fact that he knew told him something he wasn't ready to know yet. What he noticed over those first weeks wasn't what he expected to notice about a woman. He didn't think about the way she looked, or he tried not to. He thought about the way she moved through a room. The way she could be in a conversation with a combat veteran who hadn't spoken more than 20 words to anyone in 6 months and somehow get him laughing at something. The way she remembered names. The way she listened, not waiting to talk, not planning her response, but actually listening. The kind of listening that made people feel like what they were saying mattered. He thought about the time Emma had scraped her knee at the Saturday market, and Victoria had appeared out of nowhere with a first aid kit in her bag. An actual first aid kit, fully stocked, the kind of practical preparedness that he respected instinctively. And she'd crouched down to Emma's level, and talked her through every step of the cleaning and the bandaging, and told her she was brave, and Emma had nodded very seriously and believed her. He thought about the way she said his name. Not Ray, not Cole, Raymond. The full thing. The same way his mother used to, which meant it landed different. And he thought about how much he hated that he was thinking about any of this. Because who was he to think about any of it? He was a 42-year-old widower with a 6-year-old daughter and the emotional infrastructure of a man who'd spent 15 years in the military specifically to avoid having to deal with his feelings. He was a man who went to bed exhausted and woke up exhausted and spent every moment in between trying to be enough for a little girl who deserved everything. He was a man who had loved someone and lost her, and carried that loss around with him, like a second set of dog tags, always there, always cold against his chest. He was not the kind of man that someone like Victoria Shaw looked at and thought, yes, that's what I want. He was the kind of man she looked at and thought he needs support services and maybe a meal delivery subscription. He was sure of it. One evening in October, 3 months after the funnel cake incident, he and Emma ran into her at the grocery store. Not the kind of grocery store encounter you plan. The kind where you're standing in the cereal aisle in an Old Navy sweatshirt, holding a box of sugar-coated something, because Emma has been negotiating for it for 6 days, and you've finally calculated that the negotiation is costing more energy than the sugar will, and you look up, and there she is. Hey, Victoria said. Hey, he said. Emma immediately said, Daddy said yes to the cereal. Big win, Victoria said very seriously. I've been working on him for forever. How long is forever? Since before Halloween. Raymond looked at the ceiling. Victoria looked at the cereal box and then at Emma and said, Strong negotiating. You wore him down. He always breaks eventually, Emma said with the confidence of someone who had conducted extensive field research. Raymond put the cereal in the cart and looked at Victoria and said before he could stop himself, You want to get coffee? There's a place 2 blocks from here. Emma likes their hot chocolate. He heard himself say it. He watched Victoria blink just once, and in that half-second, he started forming the sentence he would use to walk it back to make it sound like a casual community program stakeholder kind of coffee to, Yeah, she said. I'd like that. And Emma pumped her fist like she'd won something. Maybe she had. They sat in a corner booth, the 3 of them. Emma had her hot chocolate, and was very busy working through a word search in the little activity book Raymond kept in his jacket pocket for situations requiring calm. Victoria had both hands around a mug of black coffee. No sugar, he noticed, and something about that detail felt like finding a familiar landmark in unknown terrain. For a while they talked about nothing. The festival coming up. A new after-school program Victoria was trying to get funded. The fact that Emma had opinions about everything, which she demonstrated by contributing to both topics with equal authority. Then Emma, with the timing of someone who had absorbed her father's instinct for saying the most important thing at the most unexpected moment, looked at Victoria and said, "Do you have kids?" Victoria's expression shifted just slightly, just a breath. "No, sweetheart, not yet." "Do you want some—" "Emma," Raymond said, "I'm just asking." "You don't just ask people that." "Why not?" "It's a normal question." Victoria smiled, the real one, the sudden one. "It's okay." She looked at Emma. "I think I'd like that someday. I think it sounds pretty wonderful, actually." Emma considered this. Then she went back to her word search and said very casually, "Daddy's a good dad." The table went quiet. Raymond looked at his coffee. Victoria looked at him, and when he looked back, because he had to, because she was still looking, what he saw on her face wasn't pity. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't the expression people put on when they learned about Sandra and didn't know what to say. It was something else. He looked away first, but not before he felt it. And that scared him more than anything had in a very long time. The coffee shop became a habit before either of them admitted it was a habit. Not every week, not even every 2 weeks. But enough that the woman behind the counter, a heavy-set lady named Brenda, who wore the same green apron every single day and had opinions about everything, started having Emma's hot chocolate ready before they reached the register. "Your usual," Brenda said one Saturday, setting the mug on the counter without being asked. Emma beamed like she'd been given a crown. Raymond looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Raymond. Neither of them said anything about what it meant that they had a usual. That was November. By December, the not saying anything had become its own kind of conversation. Raymond was aware of it, the way you're aware of a current underwater, not visible, not loud, but constantly pulling. He felt it when Victoria laughed at something Emma said, and he caught himself watching her laugh instead of watching Emma. He felt it when she texted him about a resource fair, and he read the message 4 times before responding. He felt it at 2 in the morning when he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a stack of Emma's school papers that needed signatures. And he thought just for a second, just one unguarded second, "I wish she was here." Then he shut that thought down like a circuit breaker tripping, because he knew what he was. He knew what his life looked like from the outside. He had a 6-year-old who still sometimes cried for her mother in her sleep. He had a contractor job that paid the bills but required travel 3 weeks out of every 8. He had a house that smelled like crayons and old coffee, and the particular brand of organized chaos that single fathers create when they're doing their absolute best, and their absolute best is still just barely enough. He was not a man you chose. He was a man you felt sorry for. He had decided that a long time ago, and he was sticking to it. What he hadn't decided, what he couldn't seem to control, was whether Victoria Shaw had read the same memo. She hadn't. That became clear on the Wednesday evening in mid-December when she showed up at his front door with a cardboard box, a roll of tape, and absolutely no warning. He opened the door in an old sweatshirt with a coffee stain on the sleeve that he hadn't noticed until exactly that moment, and she held up the box and said, "Emma told me you haven't put up Christmas decorations yet." He stared at her. "Emma told you that?" "She also told me you have a box of ornaments in the closet that you haven't opened since—" She stopped, recalibrated. "Since last year." The box of ornaments had been Sandra's. He'd put it in the hall closet in January and closed the door, and had been successfully not thinking about it for 11 months. He said, "She shouldn't have told you that." "She loves you," Victoria said simply. "She wants Christmas to feel like Christmas. She didn't know how to ask you." He stood in the doorway for a long moment, long enough that it became a decision. Then he stepped back and let her in. Emma came running from the living room in her pajamas. It was barely 7 o'clock, but she'd been in pajamas since 5 because Raymond had long since stopped fighting that particular battle, and when she saw Victoria, she made a sound that could only be described as a victory screech and wrapped both arms around her waist. "You came," Emma said. "I came," Victoria confirmed. Raymond closed the front door and stood there watching the two of them. Emma already pulling Victoria toward the living room, already talking at her full speed about where the tree should go, and what color lights were superior, and whether tinsel was still a thing people did, and something moved through his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. He told himself it was gratitude. That was a safe word. That was a word he could hold without it meaning too much. He went and got the box from the closet. He stood with it in the hallway for a moment, one hand on the lid. He could hear Emma's voice from the living room, loud and certain and happy. He could hear Victoria's quieter voice responding, asking questions, letting Emma lead. He opened the box. The first ornament on top was a small ceramic star with Sandra's handwriting on the back. First Christmas 2016. Emma's first Christmas. She'd been 4 months old. Too young to understand trees or lights or any of it. But Sandra had bought the ornament anyway, because Sandra always said you made the memories first and understood them later. Raymond held it for a count of 3. Then he carried the box into the living room. Victoria saw his face when he walked in. She didn't say anything. She didn't make it a moment. She just moved over on the floor where she was sitting with Emma and made room for him to set the box down between them. That was the thing about her. She always knew when not to speak. They put up the tree that night, all 3 of them. Emma narrated the entire process like a sports commentator. Raymond untangled lights with the methodical patience of a man who'd once spent 4 hours diffusing a situation that could have gone extremely badly and came out the other side, knowing that patience was the most underrated skill a human being could have. Victoria hung ornaments and asked Emma about each one, where it came from, what it meant. And Emma told her stories, some of which were accurate and some of which were clearly invented, and Victoria listened to all of them with equal seriousness. When they got to the ceramic star, Emma held it up and said, "That one was from when I was a baby. Mama picked it." The room got very still. "It's beautiful," Victoria said. Her voice didn't waver. She didn't look at Raymond for guidance. She just held the moment the way you hold something fragile carefully with both hands without squeezing. Emma hung it at the very top she could reach, which was about halfway up the tree, and Raymond moved it to the top branch after she'd gone to bed the way he did every year. Victoria was still there when he came back downstairs. She'd made tea. She'd found the mugs and the tea bags and the honey without asking, which meant she'd been paying attention to his kitchen for longer than he'd realized. And she set a mug on the table in front of his chair without a word. He sat down. He wrapped both hands around the mug. He said, "You didn't have to do this. I know. She shouldn't have called you." "Raymond." Her voice was quiet but direct. She's 6 years old and she wanted her dad to have a real Christmas. She didn't know another way to help him. He looked at the tree. All the lights were on, and the room was warm. And the ceramic star was at the top where Sandra had always wanted it, and his daughter was asleep upstairs, dreaming about whatever 6-year-olds dream about after a night like this. He said, "I keep thinking I'm going to get better at it." "At what?" "All of it." He turned the mug in his hands. The managing. The keeping it together. "I keep thinking there's a point where it stops feeling like I'm one missed step away from dropping everything." Victoria didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it sit there, and then she said, "My dad raised my brother and me alone after my mom left. I was 8. My brother was 5. She paused. "I used to watch him at the kitchen table at night after he thought we were asleep. He had this look on his face, like he was solving a math problem that had no right answer." Raymond looked at her. "You have that look right now," she said. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Great. It's not a bad thing." She met his eyes. "It means you're still trying to solve it. Men who've stopped trying don't sit at the kitchen table anymore. They just stop showing up." He thought about his own father, about the particular quality of his absence which hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but slow and gray, like a light dimming over years. He thought about the promise he'd made in that hospital parking garage. Not to Sandra, not out loud, but to himself, in the silence of the truck with the rain on the roof. I will show up, every single day, no matter what. I'm not going to stop showing up, he said. I know, she said. That's the whole point. He wasn't sure what she meant by that. He wasn't sure he was ready to ask. They sat there for a while longer, the tree lights reflecting off the dark window. The house quiet in the particular way houses get quiet when children are asleep and adults are doing that thing adults do, where they talk about everything except what they're actually talking about. Then Victoria gathered her coat and her bag, and Raymond walked her to the door, and she stopped on the porch and turned back and said, "She talks about you all the time, you know." Emma. Every time I see her at the community center events, every time I run into her at the Saturday market. Victoria held his gaze. She doesn't talk about missing her mom. She talks about you, what you made for dinner, something funny you said, a game you invented. She's not a sad little girl, Raymond. She's a happy little girl who knows her dad loves her. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Something in his throat had decided to become an obstacle. Victoria said, "Good night," and walked to her car. He stood on the porch in the cold and watched the taillights until they were gone. Then he went inside, sat back down in front of the Christmas tree, and had the most honest conversation with himself he'd had in over a year. Which was this: he was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble that could be solved by discipline or structure or by making himself busy enough that he didn't have to think about it. The kind of trouble that sits in your chest and grows roots and eventually, if you're not careful, starts to feel like it belongs there. He cared about Victoria Shaw. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't wanted it. He had actively and systematically tried to prevent it. And it had happened anyway, the way things happen when you're not paying attention to the right things, slowly, then completely. He sat with that for a long time. Then he turned off the tree lights, checked the door locks the way he did every night. Old habit would never break. It climbed the stairs, stopped at Emma's door, looked in at her, sleeping in the nest of stuffed animals she'd built around herself, and felt the usual combination of terror and overwhelming love that was parenthood. "You called her," he said quietly to his sleeping daughter. Emma didn't stir. "You're too smart," he said. "That's going to be a problem when you're a teenager." He went to bed. He did not sleep well. He was thinking about a woman who made tea in other people's kitchens without asking who knew when not to speak, who had looked at a ceramic star with Sandra's handwriting on it and held the moment like something precious without making it about herself. He was thinking about the way she'd said, "That's the whole point," like she knew something he hadn't figured out yet. He was thinking that whatever that point was, he wasn't sure he was ready for it. And he was thinking, and this was the part that kept him awake the longest, that not being ready might not matter anymore. Because some things don't wait for you to be ready. Some things just keep showing up at your door with a cardboard box and a roll of tape and the quiet certainty that you are worth the trouble. The question Raymond Cole could not yet answer, lying in the dark with his eyes open, and the house silent around him, was whether he believed that himself. He'd spent so long being the one who showed up for everyone else. The Navy, Sandra during her illness, Emma every single day. He'd built his entire identity around being the man who carried things without complaint, who kept going when going was hard, who didn't ask for anything because needing things felt like weakness, and weakness was something he'd trained himself out of before he was 22 years old. He didn't know how to be someone who was chosen. He only knew how to be someone who stayed. He was still turning that over when his alarm went off at 5:15 and he got up and he went downstairs and he did not burn the eggs. That felt like something. He wasn't sure what, but it felt like something. 3 days later, he ran into her at the community center. She was setting up chairs for a veteran support group alone in a room that needed 40 chairs arranged in a circle, and without saying a word, he walked in and started setting up the other side. They worked in silence for a few minutes. Then Victoria said without looking up, "You didn't have to." "I know," he said. She looked up then. He was already looking at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was long enough to mean something. Then Emma's voice came from the hallway she'd been at the after-school program down the hall. "Daddy, can Victoria eat dinner with us tonight?" Raymond looked at Victoria. Victoria raised an eyebrow. He said, "I can't promise I won't burn it." She said, "I'll bring the fire extinguisher." Emma cheered from the hallway, and Raymond turned back to the chairs, hiding a smile he hadn't planned on feeling. Something crack open in his chest. Small, careful, terrifying. Like a window in a sealed room being opened for the first time in a very long time, and cold air rushing in, and the shock of it. And then, the relief. Dinner became a regular thing. Not every night, not even close to every night, but often enough that Emma stopped asking, "Is Victoria coming?" and started asking, "What time is Victoria coming?" which was a distinction that Raymond noticed and chose not to examine too closely. Victoria never made it a big deal. That was the thing about her. She moved into the edges of their life so naturally that there was no single moment he could point to and say, "That's when it changed." It just did. One Tuesday, she was helping Emma sound out words from a library book, while Raymond cleaned up the kitchen. One Thursday, she was sitting across from him at the table with her own stack of work files, while Emma did homework, all three of them quiet and focused in the particular comfortable silence that takes a long time to build between people. One Saturday, she showed up with groceries because she was passing the store, and she'd remembered without being told, without a list, that Emma had mentioned being out of the good apple juice, and Raymond had mentioned offhand that he was tired of cooking the same 5 meals. She just showed up. Consistently, without drama, without asking for anything back. And Raymond, who had spent 15 years in the Navy learning to read situations accurately and respond to them appropriately, was starting to understand exactly what was happening and couldn't decide whether to lean into it or to pull the emergency brake before someone got hurt. He pulled the brake in January. It happened because of a phone call. His contractor job had been expanding good news professionally, complicated news personally, and in January, his supervisor offered him a promotion that would move him into a senior role, higher pay, more stability. The catch was that the role was based out of a different office, 60 miles away. Which didn't sound like much until you factored in Emma's school, Emma's routines, the life they'd built in Chesapeake piece by careful piece. He didn't tell Victoria about the offer right away. He didn't tell anyone. He sat with it for a week the way he sat with all major decisions, quietly, privately running through every angle before he let anyone else into the room. But Emma told her. Because Emma told Victoria everything with the unself-conscious openness of a child who hadn't yet learned to be strategic about information. Raymond found out when Victoria texted him on a Thursday evening. Emma mentioned the job offer. "How are you feeling about it?" He stared at the message. He typed and deleted 3 different responses. Then he called her. She picked up on the second ring. "She told you," he said. "She's worried you're going to move." "I haven't made any decisions." "I know." "Raymond, she shouldn't worry about things like that. She's 6. She should be worried about, I don't know, spelling tests. She's worried because she loves you and she picks up on everything you're feeling even when you think you're hiding it." A pause. "You're not as hard to read as you think you are." He stood in the kitchen. Emma was asleep. The house was quiet. He said, "I'm not moving." "Okay." "I turned down the offer this afternoon." Silence on the other end. Then, "Why didn't you tell me you were considering it?" And there it was. The question with the real question inside it. He could have said it was a professional matter. He could have said I needed to think it through alone. Both would have been true. Neither would have been the whole truth. The whole truth was that he'd spent a week telling himself the decision had nothing to do with her. That he was staying for Emma, for the school, for the house, for the community they'd built. And somewhere around day 4 of telling himself that he'd understood that he was lying, He said, "I'm going to be honest with you." "Please. I don't know how to do this." He put one hand on the counter. "I don't know how to have whatever this is and not mess it up. I've been trying to figure out what the responsible thing to do is, and every time I think I have an answer, Emma says your name in her sleep, and I have to start over." The silence stretched. Then Victoria said very quietly, "She says my name in her sleep." He hadn't meant to say that. "That's not the point." "What is the point?" "The point is that if this goes wrong, whatever this is, it's not just me who gets hurt, it's her, and I cannot let that happen. I will not let that happen." "I understand that." "Do you?" "Because she's already lost one person, Victoria. She's 6 years old and she knows what loss feels like. I'm not going to let her get attached to someone and then have that someone disappear. I'm not doing that to her." His voice had gotten harder than he intended. He heard it and couldn't pull it back. Victoria didn't react to the hardness. She just said, "Are you talking about Emma right now, or are you talking about yourself?" The question hit him somewhere he wasn't defended. He didn't answer. She said, "I'm not going anywhere, Raymond." "You don't know that." "You're right. Nobody knows anything for certain. But I'm telling you as clearly as I can tell you that I am not going anywhere. And I need you to decide if you're going to believe that or not. Because I can't prove it to you in advance. Nobody can." A pause. "That's not how trust works." He stood there for a long time after she hung up. He didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning he was short with Emma at breakfast, not cruel, not loud, just clipped and distracted, and she noticed immediately, because she always noticed, and she put her spoon down and looked at him and said, "Daddy, did you and Victoria have a fight?" "We didn't have a fight." "Your face looks like a fight." "My face looks like a man who didn't sleep enough." "Same thing," Emma said, and went back to her cereal. He dropped her at school and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes. He watched other parents walk back to their cars. Couples mostly splitting up the drop-off. One parent staying to talk to the teacher, the other heading to work, and he didn't feel sorry for himself. He'd made peace with the shape of his life a long time ago, but he thought about what Victoria had said. "Are you talking about Emma? Or are you talking about yourself?" He thought about Sandra. About the first year they'd been together, when he'd been so certain he wasn't good enough for her. She was sharp and funny and could talk to anyone. And he was a Navy kid from a small town in North Carolina who'd chosen a uniform partly because it told him what to do and how to stand and what to say in situations that otherwise would have required him to figure those things out himself. He'd told Sandra once early on that she was out of his league. She'd looked at him for a long moment and then said, "I'm going to let you believe that for about another 30 seconds, and then I'm going to need you to cut it out." He'd cut it out. Eventually. But Sandra was gone, and the deep structural belief that he was somehow less than what the right woman deserved had come back, filled in the space she'd left, settled in like it had always been there, like it had just been waiting. He drove home. He called his supervisor and confirmed the decision about the job. Then he called Victoria. She picked up immediately, like she'd been waiting. He said, "I'm sorry about last night." "You don't have to." "I do. I was using Emma as a shield. I was hiding behind her because it's easier to say I'm protecting my daughter than to say I'm scared. And you called me on it, and I hung up instead of acknowledging it." He took a breath. "That wasn't fair to you." A pause. "Thank you for saying that." "I am scared," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I'm scared of this, and I don't entirely know how to not be scared of it, but I also know that the reason I'm scared is the same reason it matters. If it didn't matter, I wouldn't be scared." "That's the most words I've ever heard you say at one time," Victoria said, and he could hear the smile in it. "Don't get used to it. Too late." He almost said it then. He almost said the thing that had been sitting in the back of his chest for weeks, the thing that was looking for a door. But he didn't. Not yet. He wasn't ready yet, and he'd learned from the Navy, from Sandra, from 15 years of making decisions that mattered, that there's a difference between courage and recklessness, and the difference is timing. Instead, he said, Emma has a school concert in February. She's been practicing this song for 3 weeks. It's about a caterpillar. A caterpillar. Apparently, it's a metaphor. For what? She won't tell me. She says I have to wait and see. Victoria laughed. I wouldn't miss it. Good, he said, and meant it. The concert was on a Thursday evening in the school gymnasium. Folding chairs badlighting a banner that said Winter Showcase in letters a child had clearly decorated. Raymond sat in the third row with Victoria beside him, and 2 seats down from them sat a woman he didn't recognize until she leaned over and introduced herself, Diane Holloway, wife of his former commanding officer, who apparently had grandchildren in the school. Raymond Cole, Diane said, warmly surprised. Charles said you'd settled in Chesapeake. How are you? Good, he said. Really good, actually. Diane looked at Victoria. Raymond made the introduction, and Diane Holloway, who had 30 years of practice reading situations accurately because she'd spent 30 years married to a man who noticed everything looked between the two of them and smiled in a way that said she understood the whole situation without a word being spoken. After the concert, Emma had been magnificent, standing in the front row in a yellow dress singing about the caterpillar, with a seriousness that suggested she had personally invested in its journey. They went out for ice cream because Emma had negotiated that as part of the concert agreement 2 weeks in advance. In the booth, Emma ate her ice cream and said very suddenly, Victoria, are you Daddy's girlfriend? Raymond's spoon stopped moving. Victoria, to her considerable credit, didn't miss a beat. She looked at Emma and said, What do you think? Emma considered this with great seriousness. I think yes, she said. But Daddy's slow. Emma, Raymond said, what you are. Victoria was looking at the table. Her shoulders were shaking slightly. She's not wrong, Victoria said very quietly to no one in particular. Raymond looked at his ice cream. He looked at his daughter. He looked at Victoria, who was now definitely laughing, doing a very poor job of hiding it. And he thought about Sandra and the 30-second deadline and the way the people who love you best are always the ones who see through you fastest. He said, I'm working on it. Emma pointed her spoon at him. Work faster. And Victoria finally stopped trying to hide the laugh and let it come clear and real and warm, and it filled the booth and the room and some space in Raymond's chest that had been quiet for too long. On the drive home, Emma fell asleep in the back seat before they cleared the parking lot, the particular immediate unconsciousness of a child who has burned every available unit of excitement. Raymond drove and Victoria sat in the passenger seat, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Victoria said softly, so as not to wake Emma, She's incredible. She's relentless, Raymond said. Same thing. He glanced at her. She was looking out the window. He looked back at the road. He said very quietly, I'm not slow. I'm careful. Raymond? What? I know, she said. Just that. I know. He pulled into the driveway. He carried Emma inside. She didn't stir dead weight in that way sleeping children have, and laid her in her bed and pulled the blanket up and stood there for a moment. The ceramic star was still on the Christmas tree downstairs, which he hadn't fully taken down yet, because Emma had lobbied hard to keep it up through January, and he'd given in on the 15th. He went back downstairs. Victoria was at the door, coat on, ready to leave. He said, Stay, have coffee. She looked at him. Just coffee, he said. I make it better than I make eggs. A pause. A small smile. Okay. He went to the kitchen and she followed, and he put the coffee on, and she sat at the table, and they talked. Really talked for the first time, without Emma at the center of the conversation, without the subject being anyone else's needs, or plans, or concerns. They talked about his time in the Navy, not the official version, but the real version. The loneliness of long deployments, the way the structure gave him something to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain, the identity crisis of the first year after leaving the service. She talked about her work, the satisfaction of it and the weight of it, the veteran families she'd helped, and the ones she hadn't been able to reach in time. They talked about their fathers. They talked about fear. At one point she said, "What are you most afraid of?" "Right now, honestly." He thought about it. He gave her the real answer, not the safe one. "That I'm not enough," he said. "That I'm asking someone to sign up for a life that's complicated and heavy and full of leftovers from before. And that eventually the weight of all that is going to be more than what?" she said. He looked at her across the table. "More than you bargained for." She held his gaze, and she didn't look away, and she didn't rush to reassure him with empty words. She just looked at him steady, clear-eyed, the way she always looked at hard things, and then she said, "Raymond, I work with veterans every single day. Men and women who are carrying things I cannot imagine. And I have never, not once, looked at what they're carrying and thought that's too much. I've only ever thought, who's standing beside them?" He didn't answer. She said, "I want to stand beside you." He looked at his coffee mug. "If you'll let me," she said. The kitchen was quiet. The house was quiet. Upstairs, his daughter was asleep, dreaming about caterpillars and metaphors, and whatever it is that 6-year-olds know about transformation that adults have to work so hard to remember. Raymond Cole sat at his kitchen table and understood for the first time that being chosen wasn't something that happened to men who had everything figured out. It happened to men who showed up anyway. He raised his eyes. He said, "I'm working on letting you." And she smiled, the real one, the sudden one, and said, "I know, that's enough for now." That's enough for now turned out to be enough for a long time. Not because things didn't move forward, they did slowly. The way things move when two careful people are both trying not to break something fragile. But because Victoria meant it when she said it, and Raymond believed her, and belief, real belief, the kind that doesn't need constant reassurance, turned out to be the thing he'd been missing most. February became March. March became April. The life they were building in the edges and evenings and weekend mornings became something with weight to it, something you could lean on. Emma stopped asking if Victoria was coming and started assuming she was. She started saving things for her drawings from school. Interesting rocks she found on the playground. Observations about the world that she apparently felt required a second adult opinion. She started telling Victoria things that she didn't tell Raymond. Not because she was hiding them, but because she understood instinctively that some things need a different kind of listener. And Victoria was that kind of listener. Raymond watched this happen and felt two things simultaneously. The way he often felt two things simultaneously: gratitude so large it had no bottom, and fear that lived just underneath it, like cold water under ice. He managed the fear the way he managed most things, by keeping moving, by focusing on what was in front of him, by telling himself that the feeling of waiting for something to go wrong was different from something actually going wrong, and that he was experienced enough to know the difference. He almost convinced himself. Then came the afternoon in April when his mother-in-law called. Her name was Ruth. She was 71 years old, sharp as a tack, and she had loved Sandra with the particular fierce tenderness of a mother who had watched her daughter choose well. She had also, since Sandra's death, been conducting a quiet and sustained assessment of Raymond's fitness as a sole parent. Not cruelly, not with any real doubt, but with the vigilance of a woman who had one grandchild left in the world and intended to make sure that grandchild was all right. Ruth called every Sunday. They talked for 20 minutes, sometimes 30. She asked about Emma's school, Emma's eating, Emma's sleep. She asked about Raymond's work. She did not, until that April afternoon, ask about his personal life. He was in the kitchen when she called. Victoria was in the living room with Emma, the two of them working on a puzzle that had been on the coffee table for 3 weeks, because Emma insisted on doing it in stages, what she called the slow way. "Raymond," Ruth said after the usual opening, "is there a woman in your life?" He paused. "Why do you ask?" "Emma told me. Last Sunday when I called and you were out getting groceries. She talked about a woman named Victoria for 11 minutes. I timed it." He moved to the hallway out of earshot. It's complicated, Ruth." "How complicated?" "She's someone I care about. We're taking it slow." A silence. Then Ruth said, "Is she good to Emma?" "Yes." "Yes." She's very good to her. Is she good to you? He leaned against the wall. From the living room, he could hear Emma instructing Victoria on exactly where a puzzle piece went, in the tone of someone who had a system and required it to be respected. He said, "Yeah, she is." Another silence. Longer this time. Then Ruth said, "Sandra used to say that you were the worst at accepting anything good." He closed his eyes. "She said you'd find a reason to push away anything that felt too right. She said it drove her crazy for the first year before you figured out that she wasn't going anywhere." Ruth's voice was steady matter-of-fact, the way she always was when she was saying something that cost her. "I'm not telling you what to do. I want you to be careful that you're not doing that again. For Emma's sake, and for yours." After he hung up, he stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he walked back into the living room where Emma was pointing at the puzzle board with one finger, and Victoria was listening with complete seriousness to a set of instructions that appeared to govern the placement of every remaining piece. Victoria looked up when he came in. She read his face. She always read his face, and she said nothing, just held his gaze for 1 second with a look that said, "Whenever you're ready," and then looked back at the puzzle. He sat down on the couch. He watched them for a while. He thought about Sandra saying he was the worst at accepting anything good, and he thought about the fact that Sandra had been right about most things, and he thought that maybe the worst thing he could do with the time he had left, whatever shape that time took, was to keep building walls around something that was already inside them. He didn't say any of that out loud. Not then. But something shifted in him that afternoon. Something that had been braced against impact slowly, carefully began to stand up straight. The climax came on a Thursday evening in May. Emma's school had a spring performance. Not a concert this time, but a full theatrical production, if you could call it that, of a story about a community coming together, which mostly involved 23 second graders in construction paper costumes, making their best effort at projection. Emma played the mayor. She had 3 lines and delivered all of them with the conviction of someone running for actual office. Afterward, in the gymnasium, families milled around with store-bought cookies and fruit punch, and Raymond was standing at the edge of the room watching Emma accept compliments from other parents with the grace of a child who had been expecting exactly this outcome when a man came and stood beside him. His name was Paul Garrett. They'd worked together briefly at the contracting firm overlapping for about 4 months before Paul transferred to a different division. He was a former Marine. Raymond liked him the way you like people who operate on the same frequency as you, minimal words, maximum efficiency. Paul said she was great. "She knows it," Raymond said. "The woman with her, that you're—" Paul stopped, started again. "Are you two together?" Raymond looked across the room. Victoria was crouching down next to Emma, and Emma was showing her the construction paper mayoral badge she'd worn during the performance, explaining something at length, and Victoria was examining it with the careful attention of someone being shown something genuinely important. He said, "Working on it." Paul looked at him. "Working on it. How long?" "Since November." Paul made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Raymond, come on. It's complicated. It's always complicated." Paul looked at him with the directness of a man who had served in Fallujah and had no patience left for avoidable suffering. "You know what I learned after my divorce? That complicated is just the word people use when they're scared of simple. The simple thing is, do you want to be with her or not?" Raymond didn't answer. "Right," Paul said, and walked away to find his own kids. Raymond stood there another moment. Then he crossed the gymnasium. Victoria saw him coming. Emma was already being pulled into a group of her classmates for a photograph, so it was just the two of them for a moment in the noise of the room. He said, "Can we talk outside?" She looked at him. "Now." "Yeah." They slipped out through a side door into the evening. The air was warm and the sky was that particular May blue that only exists for about 3 weeks before summer comes in and takes over. They stood on the sidewalk a few feet from the door, and Raymond put his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the ground, and then he looked at her. He said, "I need to tell you something." "Okay. I've been holding back, on purpose, not because of you, because of me." He pulled one hand out of his pocket and rubbed the back of his neck. I keep waiting for the part where I feel like I'm enough. Like I've got enough to offer. Like I'm not asking you to sign up for something that's harder than it should be. He shook his head. And I think I've been waiting for a feeling that's not coming. Not because things are bad, because they're good. And I don't trust good. Victoria was watching him. I know what I am, he said. I know what my life looks like. I've got a 7-year-old who's going to need everything I've got for the next 10 years. I've got a career that's still figuring out what it is. I've got baggage that I carry better than I used to, but I still carry. He looked at her. And you're smart, and you're capable, and you've built something real with your work, and you could be with someone who doesn't come with all of this. Someone without. He stopped. He actually laughed short, humorless, directed at himself. You know what I was about to say, he said. Say it, Victoria said. He met her eyes. You're way too good for me. He said it the way he meant it. Not as a performance. Not fishing for contradiction. As a genuine statement of the thing he believed in the deepest, most unreachable part of himself, the belief he'd carried since before Sandra. The belief Sandra had spent years dismantling, the belief that had rebuilt itself in the rubble of grief and come back stronger than before. He expected her to argue, to say the right reassuring thing, to be kind about it the way she was kind about everything. Instead, she went very still. And then she looked at him directly, without softness, without any of the careful handling she sometimes used around the hard edges of his life. And she said, Michael, that's exactly why I chose you. He didn't move. She said, Do you think I don't see what you are? I see it every single day. I see a man who gave up a career he loved because his daughter needed him. I see a man who burns the eggs and does the braids and sits on the floor and puts up Christmas trees and shows up every single day for a little girl who didn't ask for any of what happened to her. Her voice was steady, certain. I see a man who loved someone so much that losing her almost took him under, and he came back anyway. And I see a man who is standing in a school parking lot right now telling me he's not good enough, when the very reason he thinks he's not good enough is the exact thing that makes him... She stopped, took a breath. You are the most decent man I have ever known, and decency is not common. I have worked with hundreds of families. I know what rare looks like. Raymond stood very still. I'm not choosing you in spite of your life, she said. I'm choosing you because of it, because of what it shows me about who you are when things are hard, when nobody's watching, when there's no reward. She held his gaze. You stayed, Raymond. You always stay. That's not a liability. That is the only thing that has ever mattered to me. The gymnasium noise drifted out through the closed door. Somewhere inside, Emma was probably explaining to someone exactly why her performance of the mayor had been superior to all previous interpretations of mayors she was aware of. Raymond stood on that sidewalk and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not relief, not hope. Something older and harder and more essential than either of those. He felt seen, not pitied, not accommodated, not managed with patience and kindness. Seen, clearly, accurately, by someone who had all the information and was still standing in front of him telling him the verdict. He said, voice lower than usual, I don't know how to do this without being afraid of it. Neither do I, she said. That's not reassuring. No, but it's honest. He looked at her for a long moment. The May sky behind her, the warm air. The faint sound of 23 second graders and their families somewhere behind that door. He said, I've been in love with you since December. He said it the way he'd said the other thing, not as a performance, as a statement of fact. Plainly, directly, the way he'd been trained to report accurate information to people who needed to have it. Victoria didn't move for a moment. Then she said, December, the Christmas tree. When you found the ceramic star and you didn't make it about Sandra or about me or about any of it. You just held it right. You knew how to hold it right. He looked at his shoes for a second, then back at her. I think that was the moment. I've been arguing with myself about it since. You should have lost the argument faster, she said. I know. You really are slow. Emma says the same thing. Emma is very wise. He took one step toward her. She didn't step back. He raised one hand and she watched it come, and then his hand was at her jaw, and he said quietly, I'm done arguing. She said good, and he kissed her there on the sidewalk outside the gymnasium with the May sky overhead and the gymnasium noise behind the door, and his 7-year-old daughter on the other side of that door, absolutely definitely going to find out about this within the next 4 minutes, and absolutely definitely going to have significant opinions about it. When they stepped back inside, Emma was standing approximately 6 feet from the door with her construction paper mayoral badge in her hand and an expression on her face that could only be described as deeply personally satisfied. She looked at Raymond. She looked at Victoria. She looked back at Raymond. Finally, she said. Eat your cookie, Raymond said. I've been waiting for this for months. Emma. Months, Daddy. Victoria put one hand over her mouth. Raymond looked at the ceiling. Emma patted him on the arm with the authority of a 7-year-old who had been right about something important and intended for the record to reflect it, and then went back to her friends. Raymond stood there. Victoria was laughing, the real one, the sudden one, and he stood there and let himself laugh too, and the sound of it surprised him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because of how easy it was. How completely unexpectedly easy. He had spent so long believing that the right kind of life was behind him, that it had come once in one form with one person, and that its loss was the last word on the subject. He had told himself that a man like him, carrying what he carried, being what he was, didn't get 2 chances at that kind of life. Standing in that gymnasium, with the school banner overhead, and cookie crumbs on the floor, and his daughter across the room acting like a presidential candidate who had just won a key primary. Raymond Cole understood that he'd been wrong. Not about what he'd lost. That loss was real, and it would always be real, and he would carry it with the same care and honesty he'd always carried it. But about what he deserved. Sandra had told him once that the bravest thing you can do is let someone love you when you're convinced you don't deserve it. He'd thought he understood what she meant. He was only now beginning to. Sandra had been right about most things. That was something Raymond had learned to live with, not with bitterness, but with the particular gratitude of a man who had been loved well by someone wise. And one of the things she'd been most right about was this, that the bravest thing you can do is let someone love you when you're convinced you don't deserve it. He was still learning how to be that brave. The months after the school gymnasium, after the sidewalk, and the construction paper mayoral badge, and Emma's triumphant finally were not a fairy tale. Raymond had never believed in fairy tales, and Victoria had spent enough years working with real families in real crisis to have had any remaining fairy tale tendencies thoroughly educated out of her. What they built instead was something sturdier and less glamorous, and considerably more valuable a life. An actual ordinary, complicated, beautiful life. It had arguments in it. Not often, but real ones. The kind that come from 2 people who both have strong instincts and independent natures and opinions about how things should be done. Raymond was methodical and private, and sometimes went quiet for days when something was bothering him, retreating into himself the way he'd retreated into mission focus for 15 years in the Navy processing alone, because that was what he knew. Victoria was direct and expressive, and had approximately 0 patience for silence, when words would solve the problem faster, and she told him so more than once without apology. The first real argument was in June. Something small, a scheduling miscommunication about Emma's summer program that became something larger because it was never really about the scheduling. It was about Raymond making a decision without consulting her and Victoria feeling the edges of what they were to each other, and whether her opinion was meant to matter in the practical architecture of his life or just in the emotional parts. She said, I'm not asking you to check with me before you do everything. I'm asking you to think of me as someone who's in this with you, not someone you update afterward. He said, I've been making decisions alone for 2 years. It's a habit. I know it's a habit. I'm asking you to build a different one. He said nothing for a moment. Then, you're right. She blinked. That was fast. I know when I'm wrong. I just don't always like saying it out loud. Work on that too. One habit at a time, Victoria. She'd smiled at that. Not the big sudden smile, a smaller one, quieter. The kind that meant she was filing something away. He was learning her smiles the way he'd once learned navigation, by paying close attention and not assuming he already knew where he was. Emma observed all of this with the focused interest of a child who has been her father's only close companion for 2 years and is now conducting an ongoing assessment of the new social dynamics in her household. She had opinions. She shared them freely. She had declared early on that Victoria's presence improved the overall quality of dinner and the weekend schedule, and she had also declared in the frank manner of someone who has processed things and reached conclusions that she was glad her daddy wasn't sad anymore. He'd been in the kitchen when she said that, standing at the counter. She'd said it like it was a simple observation, the way she'd say the sky is blue or the dog next door is loud, and then she'd gone back to whatever she was drawing. He'd stood there for a long moment with his hands on the counter. Then he'd gone into the living room and sat on the floor next to her and said, "Hey." She looked up. "I wasn't always sad," he said. "I was working through something." "I know," Emma said. "But you're not working through it anymore. You're just here." She patted his knee. "It's better." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat like that for a while, his daughter drawing and him just being there, being here the way she'd said, and he thought that this was what all of it was for. Everything. The 15 years of service, the losses, the grinding, difficult months of doing it alone, the slow, terrifying process of letting someone back in. All of it was for this. Being here. Being present enough that a 7-year-old could feel the difference. Summer settled in. The three of them fell into rhythms. Victoria didn't move, and that was a conversation for later, a step for when they were all ready, and none of them were in a hurry because the thing they were building didn't need to be rushed. But she was there, consistently, in the particular way that presence, real presence, changes the shape of a space. Her jacket on the hook by the door, her tea in the cabinet, her handwriting on the grocery list because she'd been on the phone and needed to write something down and grabbed the closest piece of paper. In August, Ruth came to visit. She came for a week. She stayed in the guest room that Raymond had quietly repainted in April for reasons he hadn't fully articulated to himself at the time. She was 71 years old, and she walked with a cane now, and she had Sandra's eyes, which Raymond could look at now without flinching, which was something he'd had to learn and was quietly proud of having learned. Victoria met her on a Tuesday evening. Raymond had made dinner, nothing ambitious, nothing that could be burned, and the three of them sat at the table while Emma narrated the meal. And Ruth watched Victoria with the careful assessment of a woman who had been gathering data for months and was now conducting the final phase of evaluation. After dinner, after Emma was in bed, the three of them sat in the living room, and Ruth said directly, "Tell me about your work." Victoria told her. Straightforwardly, without performing humility or expertise, just explained what she did and why she did it, and what it looked like on the hard days. Ruth listened. Then she said, "Sandra would have liked you." The room went quiet. Victoria said, "I've heard a lot about her. She sounds like someone worth admiring." She was. Ruth looked at her steadily. She also would have been the first person to tell Raymond to stop carrying her memory like a reason to stop living. She looked at Raymond. "She told me that toward the end. She made me promise to say it to him if he needed to hear it." Raymond looked at his hands. "Do you need to hear it?" Ruth asked. A long pause. Then, "No," he said. "I think I've been hearing it. I'm just still learning to listen." Ruth looked between the two of them one more time. Then she nodded a single final nod, the kind that closes a case, and said, "All right then," and asked Victoria if she wanted more tea. The week Ruth stayed was the week Raymond finally understood that the people who had loved Sandra most were not holding him to an impossible standard. They were releasing him from one, and the difference between those two things was everything. September came. Emma started 2nd grade. She walked into school on the first day with her backpack and her lunchbox, and the particular confidence of a child who knows she is loved comprehensively and completely. And Raymond stood on the sidewalk and watched her go, and didn't try to keep his face neutral, because there was no one watching who required it. Victoria was standing beside him. She handed him his coffee she'd started doing that, just handing him things he needed before he reached for them, the way you do when you know someone well enough to predict their next move. And she said, "She's going to be extraordinary." "She already is," he said. "She gets it from you." He looked at her. "She gets it from her mother." "She gets it from both of you." Things compound, Raymond. Love compounds. He thought about that for the rest of the day. The proposal happened in October. He hadn't planned it the way some men plan proposals, with restaurants and photographers and elaborate setups that make for good social media and terrible authenticity. That wasn't who he was, and it wasn't who they were together, and he had the good sense to know it. He planned it the way he planned everything that mattered, quietly, carefully, with attention to what was actually true. It was a Saturday. Emma was at a classmate's birthday party and wouldn't be back until 4 o'clock. Raymond had spent the morning doing exactly nothing, reading, drinking coffee, letting the house be quiet in a way he no longer found lonely. And Victoria had come over around noon, and they'd been sitting in the living room for an hour talking about nothing in particular when he put his coffee down and looked at her and said, "I want to ask you something." She looked up from the book she'd been half reading. He said, "I've been thinking about what you said in May, on the sidewalk outside the school." "Which part?" "The part about standing beside me." He reached into the pocket of his jeans. He'd been carrying it for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment, and then deciding there was no perfect moment, there was only the honest one, and he set a small box on the couch between them. "I don't want you beside me for right now. I want you beside me for all of it, whatever that looks like. For Emma and for me and for whatever we build that we can't see yet." Victoria looked at the box. She looked at him. He said, "I know what I'm asking. I'm asking you to take on a life that's already in progress. A kid who has opinions about everything. A man who goes quiet when he should talk, and talks when he should probably be quiet, and burned the eggs so many times that we've reclassified it as a cooking style." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to choose this. To choose us, knowing everything." She reached out and picked up the box. She held it in both hands without opening it, and she looked at him the way she'd looked at him on that sidewalk, clearly, directly, with the full force of someone who had examined all the information and arrived at a decision. She said, "I chose you the day I read Emma's school file and drove to a community event specifically because I knew you'd be there. I chose you when you knocked over that display of brochures and apologized to them like they had feelings. I chose you every time you thought you were not enough and showed up anyway." She opened the box. She looked at the ring, simple, not flashy, exactly right. "I've been choosing you for a year, Raymond. This is just the part where it becomes official." He said, "Is that a yes?" She looked at him over the box. "That is absolutely a yes. Put the ring on my finger before Emma gets home and turns this into a theatrical event." He laughed, the full kind, the unguarded kind, and took the ring out of the box and put it on her finger, and she looked at it for a moment. And then she looked at him, and what was on her face was not the performance of happiness, but the thing itself, quiet and deep and completely real. They sat there together in the Saturday afternoon quiet. He said, "Emma's going to cry. Emma's going to take credit for the whole thing. She's going to say she saw it coming since November." "She did see it coming since November." "I know," Raymond said. "She's been right about everything from the beginning." Emma came home at 4:15, slightly late because the birthday party had run long. She came through the front door with cake on her shirt and a balloon tied to her wrist, and stopped in the middle of the living room and looked at the two of them, and then specifically at Victoria's hand. She dropped the balloon string. She looked at Raymond. She looked at Victoria. She looked at the ring. She said, "Daddy." "Yeah." "Did you?" "Yeah." Emma sat down on the floor. Directly on the floor, right where she was standing, with the decision of someone whose legs have simply declined to continue functioning. She sat there for a moment, and then she put her face in her hands and made a sound that was crying and laughing at the same time. Raymond crossed the room and sat on the floor next to her the way he'd done 1,000 times, the way he would do 1,000 more. Victoria came and sat on her other side. And Emma, 7 years old, with cake on her shirt, and one shoe untied, and a balloon trailing from her wrist, leaned into her father, and then reached out and took Victoria's hand, holding on to both of them at the same time. She said into her hands, muffled and certain, "I knew it." "I know you knew it," Raymond said. "I told you he was slow," Emma said to Victoria. "You were right," Victoria said. "I'm always right." "Emma," Raymond said. "I am, though." He put his arm around her, and she burrowed into his side, and he looked at Victoria over the top of Emma's head, and Victoria was looking back at him, and the afternoon light was doing whatever afternoon light does in October in Virginia, warm and amber, and tilted toward the end of the day, and the three of them sat there on the living room floor, and nobody moved for a while, because there was nowhere else to be. A year later, Raymond stood at the edge of the water in a small park in Chesapeake. 30 people around him. Former Navy colleagues. Victoria's family. Ruth, with her cane and her good coat. Paul Garrett, from the contracting firm, who had driven 45 minutes, and showed up in a tie, which was something Raymond would mention to him for the rest of their lives. Emma stood next to him in a dress she had selected herself, and then changed her mind about twice, and then gone back to the original choice which Raymond had predicted from the beginning. She was holding a small bunch of flowers and standing with her feet slightly apart in a posture that was recognizably, unmistakably his. Victoria walked toward them. She wore something simple and exactly right, the way she always chose things. She walked toward him with the certainty of someone who is not arriving at a decision, but completing one, confirming what was already true, putting language to what already existed. He watched her come and thought about the fall festival and the knocked-over brochures and the funnel cake that had somehow survived the collision. He thought about the coffee shop and Brenda and the hot chocolate that appeared before they reached the register. He thought about the Christmas tree and the ceramic star and the December kitchen and the conversation that had cracked something open in his chest. He thought about the sidewalk outside the gymnasium and the things she'd said that had changed the ground under his feet. "That's exactly why I chose you." He had spent so much of his life believing that the weight he carried, the responsibility, the loss, the complicated history of being a man who had loved and served and sacrificed and kept going was something a person would have to endure in order to be with him. Something to be accepted despite. A cost. She had looked at that weight and called it the reason. Not despite. Because. Because he was loyal when nobody was watching. Because he kept his promises in the dark as faithfully as he kept them in the light. Because he had chosen his daughter over his career without hesitation and without resentment, and then gotten up the next morning and done it again. She had seen what he was and decided it was enough. She had seen what he was and decided it was everything. Victoria reached him. She took his hands. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, clearly, directly, with the full weight of her attention, not managing him or accommodating him, but actually seeing him. And he looked back, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't look away first. Emma handed Victoria the flowers, and then stepped back to her spot, and then very quietly reached up and took Raymond's hand. He squeezed it. She squeezed back. The ceremony was short. The words were simple. Raymond said his and meant every syllable in the literal, exact, deliberate way he meant everything he said when it mattered. When it was done, Emma said loudly enough for the 30 people to hear, "Finally." Ruth laughed first. Then everyone else did. Raymond looked at his daughter, Emma Sandra Cole, who had come into his kitchen one morning and crashed into the back of his knees and stood there laughing at the burned eggs. And then he looked at the woman beside him, who had shown up at his door with a cardboard box and a roll of tape, and the quiet, patient, unshakable certainty that he was worth the trouble. He had once believed that the family he'd lost was the last family he would ever have. He understood now what that belief had cost him, and he understood that he was done paying it. Strength is not the ability to carry everything alone. Any man can learn to carry. The harder thing, the thing that takes more courage than any deployment, more discipline than any mission, More honesty than most men ever manage is learning to put something down. To open your hands. To let the right person stand beside you, and to truly believe that you deserve the standing. Raymond Cole had learned that, slowly, imperfectly fighting himself the whole way. But he had learned it, and as he stood at the edge of the water with his daughter's hand in his, and his wife beside him, and the October light on everything, he was no longer the man who was waiting for the good thing to be taken away. He was the man who had finally, completely, and without reservation, let it in.